And Dionysius' writings became the very foundation of all metaphysics. St. Thomas Aquinas, by the way, quotes Dionysius 1,700 times. Albert Magnus quotes him many times. And this thinker, Dionysius, who is now called Pseudo-Dionysius, pseudo meaning false or fake, was shown to be someone who must have studied with Proclus and disguised his writings in such a way that they could be accepted by the Christian tradition, which at that time was putting a formal end to all of the Platonic schools of philosophy, closed them down. Philosophers were exiled. They went into Syria. And therefore it appears that a student who totally familiar with Proclus was able to grasp this tradition, reduce it in a very beautiful way, compressed it, and that became the architect, the very foundation and the cornerstone of Christian metaphysics. When this was disclosed, by the way, and shown to be the case, it caused quite a bit of an uproar. And there are some thinkers who would still like to consider him as a great Christian, even though it was based upon the whole thing was a forgery. But in any case, that Platonic tradition then continued in Europe in a disguised, abbreviated form, through which we can then find in such thinkers as St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, Proclus did one more thing which is really startling. He made several commentaries of Plato dialogues, and he takes practically each sentence by itself, or just a couple at a time, and he shows how much philosophical richness is behind each one of his statements. And so when you read Proclus, you have to go back into Plato and stand in awe, because if Proclus is correct about how to understand Plato, Plato must have been such a startling, profound thinker that there's been no one like him in the history of the world. And the difficulty with Plato, if I can add something, is that there is always a curiosity, and this is the curiosity. Jesus had Paul. Jesus had Mark. Socrates had Plato. If they could ever switch, if there could have been a Plato for Jesus and a Paul for Socrates, they had a totally different kind of ballgame. But the immense artistry and sophistication and insight into Socrates that Plato had brought the dialogues into an art form that are truly astonishing and have astonished all people who get into them and master them. Proclus was the great master of them, opened them up in that splendid way in which he did, which brings us to wonder at the possible profundity. And some people think, in fact, he's demonstrated that. And if that's the case, then there is something going on in Plato-Socrates' era that is so enormous philosophically and of significance that it's difficult to gauge it or describe it with accuracy. Now here's a Proclus' commentary on Plato's Parmenides. And I might as well, I'll read, I'll get a nice part. Let's get a part about the way he talks about how to reach the one. What else is the one in ourselves except the operation and energy of this striving for the one? The energy and power striving for the one, that's the one. What else is the one in ourselves except the operation and energy of this striving? It is therefore this interior understanding of unity, which is a projection, as it were, an expression of the one, which is in ourselves, That we call the one. So the one itself is not nameable, but the one in ourselves, by means of this, as to what is most appropriate to it, we must speak of it and make it known to our peers. I'd like to read that again because I don't like the way I accented a sentence. What else is the one in ourselves except the operation and energy of the striving? It is therefore this interior understanding of unity, which is a projection and, as it were, an expression of the one in ourselves, that we call the one. So the one itself is not nameable, but the one in ourselves. By means of this, as what is most appropriate to it, we first speak of it and make it known to our peers. There are two activities in us, one appetitive, the other reflective. That abiding activity that is common to all may not be absent from our souls, but these must be responsible to the energies that concern the first principle, so the love of the one must be inextinguishable. This is indeed why this love is real, even though the one is incomprehensible and unknowable. But consciousness labors and falls short when it encounters the unknown. So, silent understanding is before that which is put into language, and desire is before any understanding, before that which is inexpressible, as well as before that which is analyzable. Why then do we call the understanding of unity within ourselves one and not something else? Because I should say unity is the most venerable of all things we know, for everything is preserved and perfected by being unified. Unity then is the most venerable thing which perfects and preserves everything, and that is why we give this name to the concept that we have of the first principle. Let me get another. Oh, the quote I had before is from Proclus. So Socrates says at the beginning that it is knowable, the good. But immediately adds a qualification saying how it is knowable, namely, to him to whom inclines his own light towards it. What does he mean by light? Right? Except the one in the soul. For he said the good can be compared with the sun, and that this light is like a seed from the good planted in our souls.
In any of Plato's dialogues, does he ever explore the possibility? It seems here that quite a bit flows from the creative act. The act of creation happened, then greatness must have, the idea of greatness must have already been present, the idea of beauty, justice, and so forth.
Now, the condition for things are always prior to the action. Right? The conditions for a fire must be present before a fire. The conditions for growth must be prior to growth. The conditions for creation must be prior to creation. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things in my reading of the dialogue, Socrates' method seems to be that it would seem that if Socrates were here today, or at least I know I do when I